All right, join me now in the book of Proverbs, if you have a Bible with you. Proverbs chapter 7. The section of Proverbs that we're going through discusses the subject of sex and sexuality and sexual sin and God's design for sex a lot. Most of the time in church, sex is not the topic of conversation because that's not often the topic of conversation in the Bible. But in this section of Scripture, it is. So I find like you talk about sex one time in church, people are like, good for you, I'm glad we're talking about that. We should, because those are good things to hear. You do it again and people are like, yeah, okay, the Bible does say that. You do it a third time and people are like, all right already. We heard you the first 2 times. Let's move on. So this morning will be the last one because it's the last time in this section of Proverbs that we discuss it. I want you to be listening this morning for a couple of things. Specifically, what Proverbs chapter 7 discusses is seduction. Now that's interesting. Did you know the Bible explicitly deals with seduction? Like the allure, the appeal of sex and sexuality is spoken to directly in the Scriptures. Now, lest you think, I don't really struggle with sexual morality, so this really doesn't actually apply to me. Hey, this would have been great to know like 40 years ago when I was younger, but that's not really for me yet. Or this might be really meaningful when I get married or find someone that I want to give myself to sexually, but this doesn't really apply to me yet. Know that what we're going to find this morning in Proverbs is the same pattern or pathway. This is how sin works. Sin preys upon our disordered desires that we all have, sexual or otherwise, and we become enticed by the allurement of sin, and we think it's going to be better, whether it's sexual sin, financial sin, any kind of sin. Like we're rational creatures. We move towards sin because we think it's a good idea, and then we often learn the hard way and are like, "God, what was I thinking? That was so dumb." It probably was. But there are reasons why you moved towards it and got seduced by it. So, though we're talking explicitly about sexual sin this morning, this lays out a framework, a blueprint, a pathway of how sin tends to operate in our hearts. So join me in Proverbs chapter 7. And this morning, as the Scripture invites us to become aware of our vulnerability towards sexual sin, and ultimately our vulnerability towards all sin. I hope this morning as we end, you will be freshly encouraged and reminded of how good God is and how powerful He is, and how there is always hope to leave a path and an avenue of sin in any form and walk again or walk the first time down the road of obedience to what the Lord has said. Let me read to you Proverbs chapter 7, and then we'll make application to it in our own lives. My son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon he will come home. With much seductive speech she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him. All at once, he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into a snare. He does not know that it will cost him his life. And now, O sons, listen to me, and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. This is the word of the Lord. It ends and it begins with the antidote, with the instruction that will preserve you from the life of folly and foolishness. This teaching, understood and applied, will preserve you from much of the harm and destruction of sexual sin. It is not a foregone conclusion that in this life you have to lose your way sexually. You don't have to. You can hear what God has said. You can practice what God has said. And I promise you, because God promises you, you will be spared from heartache, from dysfunction, from complication, from confusion in your life and in the lives of those around you. There are few areas of life that are as critical as how we understand the design of sex and sexuality and how we live it out. This teaching is profound and it's powerful, and it will help you if you understand and you apply it. The truth is, in our fallen world, because we are all fallen human beings, the way that Solomon ends with the imagery in verse 26 and 7, that many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. This is personifying sexual immorality as a woman, because it's written to a young man. If this was written to a young woman, sexual immorality would be personified, sin would be personified as a man. So this isn't about men and women. This is about God's way versus the way of the world. It's true in our culture that sexual immorality and sin waylay most people. I mean, this image is graphic. That this one woman that Solomon portrays as attractive and appealing, this one woman has slain thousands, a mighty throng, it says. Many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. So this is true. So the pile of corpses that have been waylaid by sexual immorality are massive and many. That means we should expect to find in our world that there are many, even among those who are numbered with the redeemed, who have been forgiven of their sin, that they too have lost their way at times and seasons in sexual sin. As fallen creatures in a fallen world, we are not exempt from the peril of sin or from the peril of sexual sin. We should not be surprised. We should actually anticipate that even in a group of us, there are probably many, who at times and seasons of their life have to say, I gave in to the lie and the appeal of sexual immorality, and I have something to confess. Or I'm giving. I can feel in my heart I am losing the battle to believe that what God says about sex and sexuality is right. I can feel God moving away. I can feel my flesh becoming inflamed. I need a help. We should expect that because the Word of God is true. And those who lose their way sexually are a massive group. We should hear the echoes of what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. That sure, if someone commits adultery in the time of Christ, according to the Old Testament law, they deserve death. Of course, you already know that that's a serious sin. But what you may not be aware of is that the one who lusts after a woman, lusts after one who isn't their spouse, is guilty of adultery in the center of their being. So as we have said many times as we consider the subject of sexual immorality, there is no one who can raise their hand and say, I am pure at the depth of my being. Thought, word, and deed, I am sexually pure. That's not the case. You can pursue the path of purity as we ought to, but there is no one who can say, I am entirely pure. So this applies to us, not just those who are a part of the world. This applies to all, even in the church. Go back with me in verse 6 and we'll work our way through. We're going to end with the encouragement of the beginning and the end of the chapter. And what we're going to see now, what we're going to be introduced to first, is our vulnerability. So the parent is observing the vulnerability of ignorance. Verse 6, for at the window of my house, this is the father speaking, I have looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house, in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. Now, those of you who are older, don't just say, yeah, the young people need to hear this message. This is important. Because, it is. But in the book of Proverbs, the youth, the simple, the young, are uncommitted to God and his ways. They're not just chronologically younger. They may be chronologically younger, but they could be 60 or 70 or 80. You could be in the last season of your life and still be uncommitted to the ways of God, still trying to decide, am I going to listen to him and follow him, or am I just I don't know yet. That's the one who is simple, the one who is uncommitted, the one who is yet to decide, God is true, God speaks true, I will align my life to him. I will identify desires in my own life that are disordered, and I will submit them to him and ask him for help to reorient them, to correct them, to change them, to help me live life in greater obedience to him. That's the one who is the youth or the young man lacking sense. This points out two things as we get started, that we all need instruction. If you are unaware of your vulnerability to sin or to sexual sin, you are that much more in jeopardy of falling victim to it. Instruction has to be given. We need counsel. We need instruction. We are not born with it. If parents, grandparents, teachers, youth leaders, older, wiser people, if we are not intentional and purposeful about dispelling ignorance, about sin and sexual sin, we are naive if we think it won't affect our kids, our community, our church. The parent who is wise, just like the parents in Proverbs, has sexuality and sex a regular part of training and bringing up. We should have families of parents, of grandparents, of aunts and uncles who are reminding, you have to teach it first to then remind, who teach first the beauty of God's design for sex. That's what Proverbs chapter 5 is. God's way is good, and you don't just have to take my word for it. Look at what the scriptures say. How much more wonderful if a parent can say, and this has been what my experience has been like. When I have obeyed, when I have walked in obedience, this is some of the blessing I have experienced. Please, if you're a parent and a grandparent, be one who initiates conversation about sex and sexuality. You should normalize in your home this kind of conversation. It should not be a reason to blush or to be embarrassed. Not in the home, not in the church, because all of us are sexual beings. All of us are affected by these things. We ought to initiate conversations with young people early and often. Don't let somebody else be the first one to talk to your kids about sex, because it might be some ignoramus on the bus. It might be some hormone-crazed teenager on the football team. It may be someone who has been exposed to sexual content long before they had the maturity to process it. And you may leave your kids, your grandkids, your friends in ignorance about the dangers and the joys of sex and sexuality. This is what the Proverbs do. And this is a great reminder that we ought to do that as older people, wiser people by God's grace. All right, verse 8 and 9 now introduce the subject of vulnerability. The one who is ignorant is at the wrong place at the wrong time. Verse 8, wrong place. Passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house. Wrong place. Just wandering on that street, passing along the street near her corner, on the road to her house, without realizing it. At the wrong time, in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. You're like, oh, nothing good is happening after this. Wrong place, wrong time. Because we are all hunted prey. That's what he says next. Behold, the woman meets him. Who has initiated the contact? The woman meets him. Now, let me say this again. This isn't about men and women. This isn't like women are sexually deviant and they have this sexual power and they just cast it over unsuspecting men who are just lured away powerlessly to sexual immorality. That's not what this is saying. We know from the scriptures that there are three great enemies. The world, that's the fallenness of the world, embedded in ideology, in systems and structures. That's the world. There's the flesh. That's the sinful part of humanity that all creatures, all human creatures have since the very fall. And then there is the evil one, the devil, the adversary, the father of all lies. These three together, and it's difficult to always to discern who is responsible for what. These three together are being personified here in a conversation about sexual immorality as a woman, right? But this is speaking of the world, the flesh, and the devil. You are hunted. You are hunted. This heightens the significance of speaking about these things regularly and accurately because you're hunted. Sexually speaking, in a fallen world, you are hunted. And you cannot build a bunker deep enough into the ground that will keep your children and your grandchildren and your friends from being exposed to sexual immorality. You are hunted. Behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She's loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. Then how in the world does this person not realize they're in jeopardy? Because they're ignorant of their own vulnerability. We ought not to be ignorant of our vulnerabilities towards sin or towards sexual sin, because we are hunted. If we did a show of hands, it would be really painful, so I'm not going to ask you to do it, but it would also be enlightening. If I asked you to raise your hand if you'd been exposed to pornography before you hit puberty, there'd be a lot of hands that go up in the room, because you are hunted. How many times could you testify to just having a sexually illicit image come into your mind? You weren't even thinking about that. It's just there. How many times could you testify to finding yourself unwittingly attracted to someone who isn't your spouse? Like, before it even happens, you realize, like, oh, whoa, what was that? Because you're hunted. Sin hunts you. Sin is crouching at your door, the book of Genesis says. The New Testament says that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. You are hunted. And if you are ignorant of your vulnerability, you are easy prey. That's what Solomon is saying. There is vulnerability that is common to all people, right? When you're sad, when you're hungry, when you're angry, when you're lonely, when you're tired, often when you're grieving, when you're under great stress, there are very common vulnerabilities that we all share. You shouldn't be ignorant about those things. There are also vulnerabilities that come from your upbringing. What were you taught about sex? What was modeled to you about sex? How did your parents, if you grew up with a mom and dad in the home, what did they model about sex? Were you allowed to talk about it, or was it something that was kind of shameful and a secret? But that creates a vulnerability for you. What kind of relationship are you in now? If you're a single adult that doesn't have the blessing of a sexual partner according to God's design, that creates a unique temptation. What if you're in a marriage that is currently without sex? That's a unique vulnerability. Right? There's all kinds of different vulnerabilities that are unique from your upbringing. Do you acknowledge them? Are you aware of them? Have you ever considered that? I want to introduce a resource to you that I promise you will be painful to read, and I think it may be very helpful to you if you're willing to learn about this. There's a few copies of it out at the welcome desk. But you can find it online. If you're a brave soul that wants to pick one up at the welcome desk, we made it less expensive for you. And I would say just own it. Just get that book and just hold that thing up high and just ask anybody else if they want a copy, because there's only 2 left, because I just took one. I'm not going to be watching you be like, ooh, that marriage is in trouble. Ooh, that young person is in jeopardy. No, we should be able to talk about these things. These are important. This book, I read this book because I wanted to understand experiences in my own life with others who have had adultery, and I'm like, how does that work? I wanted to understand this more. And I got more than I bargained for, because then this book, I think where it's really helpful is it helps you explore your own vulnerabilities. If you're in a marriage, if you're a woman and you're in a marriage with a husband and things have gotten a little bit frosty, you get along, you're good roommates, but it's been a long time since he gazed into your eyes and is like, tell me what you were thinking about today. It creates a vulnerability because you want that. If you're in a marriage and you're a man and your wife, just you've fallen out of the habit of hearing things of your wife's respect for you, her appreciation for you, and you start to feel like nobody really appreciates me. They appreciate me at work, and that woman at work, she appreciates me. There's a vulnerability. These things are common. They're not rare. They're unfortunately common, but because they're common, they're knowable. If you've never considered your vulnerability and you're interested, that's a resource that will help you do so. We all have a vulnerability. Nobody is exempt. And then now, here are some steps that the scriptures lay out that happen. I don't know that the scriptures are trying to make the point this is the exact order that these things happen, but these are the things that happen. Here's what we're going to see, that they tend to start innocently enough. I guess that would be step 1 all the time. They start innocently enough. And then there is flattery, the flesh, and false assurance. That'll be a big bit of an outline. First, verse 14. What is evil is couched as good. I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. Now don't lose sight of what happens next. What she offers in enticing is sex all night long, crazier than you've ever imagined, the most intoxicating, wonderful thing ever. That's what verse 18 says. This is what she's talking about. Why does she lead out with religion? Who would mask evil with religion? Well, lots of people. That's really pretty common. Now, I don't imagine sexual morality is going to present itself to you as saying, hey, I offered my vow today, and I'd like you to come home with me. You're probably going to live your whole life without ever hearing that from a person. But you will find yourself in circumstances that seem like they're good, like this is a good thing, where a real motive is disguised, maybe even to the other person's heart. Because this one, personified as a woman, verse 10, the woman meets him dressed as a prostitute and yet wily of heart, guarded of heart. Maybe that is an indication, even unaware of the motives in play. I had to offer sacrifices. Today I have paid my vows. Very often sexual sin begins with the actual motive disguised or even presented as a good thing. It's just a friendship. We just have similar interests. Hey, could you give me some insight into my wife. You're a woman. I respect your opinion. Could you just help me understand my wife a little bit? Could you help me with something? I just have a little project that I need help with. My husband really doesn't know how to do that, but it seems like you're good at that. Like, could you help me with that? A friend raises concern about the time you spend with another individual. No, just a friend. They just really understand me. I just need someone to understand me. We just share the same interest. We just have the same interest. We're just enjoying our activities together. I've been under a lot of stress, and I can't talk about this with my spouse because it just stresses them out more. This is just helping me process my stress. This is just helping me process my grief. My wife, she's really struggling by the same thing that's making me sad. I just can't keep bringing this to her. This is just to help me. Right? These are all vulnerabilities that we have that we should be mindful of. And then we go from a vulnerability of something that seems perfectly fine and could be and might be. But then now flattery gets involved. Look at verse 13. She kisses him, she seizes him, and with bold face she says, verse 15, flattery, I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. Verse 21, with much seductive speech she persuades him, and with her smooth talk she compels him. On the way to sexual sin is flattery. You hear things from the other person. You hear things from pornography. You hear things from the emotional affair that you fantasize about. You hear things that are affirming, that stroke your ego, that feel good, that build you up. In Proverbs, there are 4 times where the parents are instructing their son about sexual immorality. All 4 times. Smooth speech is referenced. Flattery is part of sexual sin. And if you don't know your own vulnerability to hearing what you want to hear, right? This isn't hard to imagine. All of us who are married, probably almost all of us who are married, could testify to times and seasons of marriage where communication breaks down. It's a little bit cold. You feel taken advantage of. You feel unseen. And then you find someone who is willing to see all the wonderful things in you that your spouse doesn't see. Flattery. They assume the best about you. They see the narrowest little sliver of you. And it feels so good to hear someone say these wonderful things about you. I mean, that aren't entirely true, which is why your spouse doesn't only say those things, but it feels so good to hear that. Flattery. We are all vulnerable. I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly. I have found you. Flattery. Verse 16 to 18. The flesh, the enticement of the flesh. We are sexual beings. God's design of sex is good and it's powerful. Proverbs chapter 5 likens it to intoxicating. It's captivating. It's alluring. It's appealing. We should not be ignorant about that. And we should be very mindful of the vulnerability of our own fallen flesh to become enticed. Right? It shouldn't be a surprise to young people that when they look at certain images, their body responds in a certain way. There's no reason that should catch a kid off guard because it's knowable. It's able to be understood. We know what happens to our bodies, what happens to our flesh when we put ourselves in the wrong place at the right time. Thinking about the wrong things, watching the wrong things, listening to the wrong things, staring at other people's right things that are the wrong things for you. We all know what happens, and we shouldn't be ignorant or naive. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. You're probably never going to be enticed to sexual immorality by a person telling you that they just bought some fine threaded sheets from Target. Put this in the context. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Aloe is a plant. I don't want plant in my bed, and I don't want the goo that comes out of aloe on my sheets. And I don't want cinnamon on my sheets either, because that's like, I have to clean that up afterwards. This is a poetic image of what is enticing, what is alluring. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. It says what you think it says. I can offer you something better than anybody else ever has. This is going to be wonderful. This is going to be intoxicating. Flattery, flesh, false assurance. These three elements, this is a recipe for sin, not just sexual sin. You have no problem with sexual sin. Praise be to God. You have problems with other kinds of sin. In there is flattery, in there is the incitement of your flesh, and in there is a false assurance. Look at the false assurance here. Verse 19. My husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. We're not going to get caught. No more trying to pretend like this is a good thing. Now we've just moved into, you're not going to get caught. Hey, you can text me at this number. He doesn't ever check my phone. You can call me anytime you want. She doesn't pay attention to that. I keep a password on my phone. The kids aren't going to see. You can contact me at that any time. This is a false assurance. We're not going to get caught. My husband is not at home. In fact, he's gone on a long journey. Further evidence, and now we're trusting a person who's a liar. That's a vulnerable place to be. He took a bag of money with him. He's out on business. He's got the resources he needs to be gone for a long time. He's distracted by other things. He's fully engaged in life elsewhere. Don't worry about it. We're not going to get caught. At full moon, he will come home. How presumptuous. Well, now she knows when he's going to come back. That's a pretty nice assurance. You ever tell yourself, as you're moving towards sexual sin, I'm not going to go that far. I know this is bad. I'm only just going to do this for a couple more minutes. We're only just going to do this one more time. I'm not going to have sex with him. I'm not going to go that far. Just one more time. Just a little bit. And then I'll send him home. Come on. These things are known. The deceptiveness of sin is known, and we readily fall prey, and we don't have to, but we often do. Because our flesh gets incited, and we hear what we want to hear, and we receive false assurances, and we tell ourselves we won't get caught, no one will get hurt, and it's all a lie. Verse 21, with much seductive speech she persuades him, with her smooth talk she compels him, and all at once he follows her. This is why the teaching of the New Testament says, run! Be mindful of your vulnerability. See sexual immorality hunting you and stay away. Don't watch that TV show. Don't tell me that there's a redemptive value in it. Your heart is drawn to it and you know it, so stop. Don't go to that movie. Don't drink those liquids. Don't be with those people in that place or time. We know our vulnerabilities when we're thinking clearly. If we don't run, what happens? What will seem like to us is all at once it got out of hand. All at once. You reach a tipping point and you fall. All at once he follows her. And now these images are graphic. As an ox goes to the slaughter. Picture that now. Get the knife out and hold it in your hand. An ox is big. That thing will gore you if you don't know what you're doing. That animal is way more powerful than you are, and now you have a knife. And this ox, ignorant, naively being led to the slaughter, someone's going to take the knife, it's in your hand, and slits the throat. What does that sound like? What kind of sound does an animal make when that happens? You talk to anyone who has gone too far down the road of sexual immorality, and you let them tell you what it was like for them to have to confront the reality of their sexual sin. The devil's never going to tell you how painful that is, but people who have experienced it will. And it's 10 times worse than an ox getting a throat slit, or as a stag that's caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver, or as a bird rushes into a snare. He does not know that it will cost him his life. The false assurance from the world, the flesh, and the devil are sobered by the reality of the actual consequences of sexual sin. And they're real. So it ends. And now, O sons, listen to me, be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her paths. Don't stray onto her paths. For many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. But it doesn't have to be this way. And there is hope. There is hope even for those who have to tell the truth, that they have walked a road of disobedience, of sexual sin, and they have harmed themselves and others greatly, to their regret, their shame, their embarrassment. But you don't have to stay there. So let's go back to the beginning and be reminded of the antidote, the power. This is the power to overcome not just sexual sin, all sin. My son, keep my words, treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. This is a picture of priority, prizing, value. This is how we rightly order our desires. This is how we overcome disordered desires. We take into the very center of our being God, the truth of God, and His Word. And it protects us, it guards us, it guides us. Look at the imagery of keep the teaching as the apple of your eye. Picture now you're having an intimate conversation with someone that you love. What do you see when you stare at their eyes? Like literally at their eyeballs. Not like I'm gazing into your soul. No, I'm talking about looking at the person's eyeballs. When you see their pupils, what do you see? Yourself. It's a picture of focused gaze, of being captured, of valuing highly. When we value God highly, when we value His Word highly, is our highest love, our highest joy, our deepest commitment. It saves us not just from the peril of sexual sin, but of all sin. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Ingest the truth. Let it change who you are. Meditate upon the truth. Memorize the truth. Believe deeper and deeper in your being that what God says about life is the truth about life. And what God says about you is the truth about you. This is the process by which we become increasingly defined by who God is and what He has done than we are by our sin and our shame. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. God and His Word is the protection from sin. And it's the pathway out when we find ourselves there. We're going to celebrate communion this morning. And what I want to offer you the opportunity to do is to walk again the road that is familiar to any mature Christian, the road of confession and repentance and forgiveness. I think it's difficult sometimes to talk about sexual issues because sexual sin is so rampant in our culture. I think one of the largest reasons many parents don't have more honest and open conversations with their kids about sex is because they feel like their own example wasn't a good one. And what are they going to say to their kids? Do better than I did? Hey, do what God says. I didn't. You should, though. Sexual sin mars so many. And so as we talk about it, it's easy to feel conviction for our sin and we hang our head. But here's what we need to remember. And this is what we're going to practice in communion this morning and then the songs that we sing. The ushers would come. You could begin to distribute the elements and the band can come as well. Whenever you feel conviction of any kind of sin, whether you are in Christ or the Holy Spirit is wooing you towards Jesus for the first time, when you feel conviction of your sin, you do well to confess. That's saying the same thing about it that God does. You call a spade a spade. You don't minimize your sin. You don't justify it. You don't excuse it. You just look it square in the eyes and you say, God, I am guilty. I am not who you say I should be. And on this point, in this action, in this attitude, I am absolutely wrong. I am sorry, I am wrong. That's confession. When you take confession to the cross, it's important that there you are reminded of what God says and what he has done. If all you do is stay in the place of feeling the shame and the guilt of your sin without confessing it at the cross, without being reminded of Jesus' death and resurrection on your behalf, then you just get stuck in shame and guilt. I mean, that can happen to children of God. Some of you could testify to a burden of shame and guilt that you carried far longer than you should have, because for some reason you couldn't bring yourself to tell the truth about your sin to others, or you couldn't exercise enough faith to believe that you are actually forgiven. So, as we celebrate communion this morning, we are remembering the reason that we can confess our sin at the cross and be reminded of forgiveness is because Jesus has already paid the price for sin. You can try to pay the price for your own sin, but that will end in your permanent eternal death. Or you can receive the price that Jesus paid for your sin, his life, that then he rose from the dead. So if you're feeling convicted of sin this morning, that's good. That's wonderful. Confess it. Go all the way to the cross. And if you have never placed your sin at the foot of the cross, as we say, that's the right place to leave it. To just admit to God that you are not who he says you should be. That you have violated his commands in all sorts of areas. And when you look at the depth of your being, you see selfishness. You make that known to God and ask him to forgive you. And he will. He will. If you believe that Jesus, when he died on the cross, actually paid the debt of your sin, that's actually what makes you a Christian. And then you can receive from God his forgiveness and the power you need to lead a new life. All right, so whether you're walking this road for the very first time or walking this road for the 10,000th time, we can do so because of what Christ has done for us. All right, let me initiate just a time of quiet prayer and then we'll sing.